Reflections. Sin's Thoughts, Excerpts from Knowing Sin, by Mark Jones. Chapter 15. The mind is its own place, and in itself, can make heaven of hell, a hell of heaven, so said Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost. Satan's theology is, in the end, wrong, but he does capture the monstrosity of the mind, a place where all types of contradictions and absurdities take place. One can guess what a place of beauty Adam's mind must have been before the fall. He had access not only to the world around him, but also to knowledge of divine things in accordance with God's will. But with the fall, his assessment of natural man's thoughts is not promising. God made man in his image and likeness, and very good, Genesis 1 verse 31. But several chapters on from the calamitous fall into sin, the Lord looked down at the wickedness on earth, noting that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, Genesis 6 verse 5. This stunning indictment on humanity at this time in world history brought a worldwide judgment by flood. The punishment fit the crime, the root of which was evil-inclined thinking proceeding from corrupt hearts. Only Noah, an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith, Hebrews 11 verse 7, and his family were spared. Yet even those professing to belong to the Lord have come under some searching denunciations concerning their thoughts. O Jerusalem, wash your heart from evil, that you may be saved. How long shall your wicked thoughts lodge within you? Jeremiah 4:14. In Matthew 9 verse 3, the Jewish scribes were speaking to themselves, claiming that Jesus blasphemed because he forgave the paralytic of his sins. In response, Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, "Why do you think evil in your hearts?" Matthew 9 verse 4. Our Lord was quite familiar with the problem of sinful thinking. He later spoke about such testifying, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander," Matthew 15 verse 19. Notice that Jesus actually lists the evil and heart-induced thinking first, before other heinous sins. The heart includes, said Charnock, all the inward operations of the soul, which play their part principally in the heart, whether they be the acts of the understanding, the resolutions of the will, or the blusterings of the affections. Clearly, we need to take the subject of sinful thinking seriously. In fact, Goodwin rightly recognized the immense task of considering the vanity of thoughts, the very title of his work on the subject, of which he claimed, would prove of all else the vastest. Goodwin described thoughts as all the internal acts of the mind of man, of what faculty soever, all those reasonings, consultations, purposes, resolutions, intents, ends, desires, and cares of the mind of man, as opposed to our external words and actions, Isaiah 66 verse 18. And when these thoughts arise and pass through, they usually do so in connection with an affection, such as anxiety, fear, or happiness. By stating that thoughts arise, usually related to affections, we affirm that both non-sinful and unwanted intrusive thoughts about sinful things may occur. We live in a fallen world with many evil things before our eyes and deep within our hearts. We process things not simply by sight but by understanding. The mere viewing of or reflection upon sin is not sinful. For example, witnessing or thinking about someone committing murder does not necessarily mean we have committed a sin, since we can either disapprove or approve of the action. The intention of the thoughts from the heart determines the character of the thought, Genesis 6 verse 5. We may see or think about a sin without necessarily being guilty of the sin. But the moment the will wills it, even in the mind and soul, the thinker is guilty of sin. Charnock noted that thoughts are morally evil when they have a bad principle, lack a proper end, and converse with the object in a wrong manner. In the case of the good angels, they apprehend the sin that caused the other angels to fall, but they do not know the sin that caused the other angels to fall, but they do not know the sin by what theologians call a practical cognition. Similarly, Glorified saints may remember their sins on earth, but only in a way to enhance in their minds the mercy of God, not to delight in such sins. Jesus understood the nature of temptation in his wilderness testing at the hands of Satan, Matthew 4, and what was being offered to him. Yet he never transgressed, even though his mind apprehended what Satan was, deceitfully, offering. God knows and sees all things with a full knowledge, but his infinite holiness means he cannot sin in his awareness of all the sins of all people in all ages. When God, Christ, angels, and glorified saints reflect upon sin, they detest it in a manner appropriate to their ability to hate sin. Saints on earth who possess indwelling sin are capable of such hatred, but with an imperfect, though truly renewed, ability. There arise what some call the first motions of sinful thinking, which come from the corruption that is in us, even from remaining sin in true believers. Formal consent or inclination to the corrupt thought may not be immediately present to our mind for it to be a sin. In other words, while a memory of a past sexual sin may not be sin, the person may have a desire arising without realization of such. The heart and mind are deceitful, with many thoughts arising because we lack sufficient holiness to keep them from flowering in our hearts. The immediate arising of an evil inclination, albeit without recognition, makes the thought sinful. As Charnock argues, voluntariness is not necessary to the essence of a sin, though it may be to the aggravation of it. We must set certain boundaries for our thoughts, and our failure to guard them is our responsibility before God and His Word. Even when a thought springs up, as it were, without our formal consent, we cannot excuse ourselves if that thought is in violation of God's will. The Christian is to take every thought captive to obey Christ, 2 Corinthians 10 verse 5. When a flurry of sinful thoughts erupts in the mind, we cannot excuse ourselves, even if there is more aggravation in the sin if we dwell on these thoughts and let them ruminate in our minds instead of immediately mortifying them at their first rising. Consider Goodwin's remarks, that even those thoughts, wherein he ravishes the heart, rather than begets them on us, if there be not any consent to them in us, I yield those thoughts are punishments often of neglect of our thoughts, and of our allowing them to wander. These involuntary thoughts are often because we fail to fan into flame the gift of God, which is given to all believers so that we have a spirit of power, love, and self-control, 2 Timothy 1 verses 6-7. But while we should always seek to mortify the first rising of a sinful thought that happens, as it were, involuntarily, Goodwin said that the more dangerous realm of sinful thoughts lies in the voluntary acts whereby we ponder and pore, and muse upon things. Charnock said thoughts are sinful when they have no lawful object, no right end, they are not governed by reason, they are eccentric, disorderly in their motions, and they are like the jarring strings of an untuned instrument. We can sin without thoughts in relation to God, ourselves, and others. These may be either sins of omission or commission. We are guilty not only for what we think that is contrary to God's will but also what we fail to think that we ought to when the context demands a certain thought, for example, rejoicing at the lawful success of a neighbor instead of harboring envy.